This presentation is brought to you on behalf of the Department of Developmental Education. This presentation is part 3 of a series of 4 on the 4 types of sentences, and it will focus on the complex sentence. I think the reason why the sentence called the complex sentence is called complex is that it attempts or works to merge 2 different types of sentences together. One is a dependent clause, and one is an independent clause. Now, don't let that language confuse you, okay? I'm going to try to explain it to you this way. When we say something is a dependent clause, okay, I want you to think of it in terms of the world that we live around us. For instance, we hear that word lots of times. For example, we fill out our taxes, and you have a dependent, that is what? A child. That means the child is dependent on us, okay? You can say that if I'm independent, right, or Independence Day, freedom, okay? So independent is actually the opposite of dependent. So if to be independent, that means you are self-sufficient, you have a job, you can pay your bills, you go to school, you're sufficient, you are independent. That means that you can stand on your own. So keep that in mind as we work through the complex sentence. So let's review. Dependent means that I cannot stand on my own, that I'm incomplete in some way. Not in a negative way, but I'm incomplete and I'm depending on something else to make me whole. That's going to be important later when we explain how to craft a complex sentence. Independent means what? I can stand on my own. More than likely, what are we talking about there? A complete sentence. So, with that being said, the complex sentence, if I told you now that a complex sentence is the blending of a dependent clause with an independent clause, I just want you to visualize that. That must mean that I have an incomplete thought blended with what? A complete sentence. And that incomplete thought, or what we call, English teachers call a dependent clause, right? That dependent clause, or that incomplete thought, can either come in the front of that sentence or where? In the back of the sentence, okay? So, I'm going to walk you through that, but I wanted to first start with that so you can conceptually understand what we're talking about when we broach the subject of building a complex sentence. Now, complex sentences, as I said, we are joining a dependent clause, which is an incomplete sentence, with what? A complete sentence. So first, before I even get into the dynamics, I just want you to look at one first, okay? I just want you to look at one. I'm going to scroll down. Let's take a look at this before I even explain how to construct them. Although it is raining outside, comma, we are going to the park. So, we need to first identify what part of this sentence is incomplete in nature. The comma is a clue because the comma, okay, is separating the incomplete thought from the sentence, the full sentence, okay, the beginning of the complete sentence. So let's take a look. It's either going to be over here, although it is raining outside, or it's going to be over here, we're going to the park. We know from the other lessons that we've looked at in the first video, we looked at simple sentences. In that particular presentation, I told you that sentences begin typically with what? They begin with a subject, then they also, what's after the subject? You have a verb, and then you have a complete thought. So if we look at this very first word over here, let's try to put that through the test. Although. I ask you, is the word although a subject? You know, subjects are typically nouns or pronouns, right? Right? They name things, typically. Although. Although is not a subject. So that's a big clue that you're probably dealing with what? You're probably dealing with an incomplete sentence. Okay, but notice over here, this part of the comma, here's the right side of the comma, the word we. We is a pronoun, so that probably is a signal that we are beginning a new sentence. We are going to the park. Sounds like a complete sentence to me. Has a subject, right? Are going where? To the park. So we are going to the park is our sentence. And although it's raining outside is an incomplete thought. That's our dependent clause. Now let's take a look. If somebody walked up to you and said, although it's raining outside, and they walked away, would you know what they were talking about? Absolutely not, because it's incomplete. It's a dependent clause. The only way that you will know what they're talking about is that you have to introduce an independent clause. You have to introduce what? When I say independent clause, don't let that throw you. I'm simply saying you have to introduce a sentence, a complete thought. So although it's raining outside, what? Although it's raining outside, we're going to the park. Now everything makes sense, okay? Because now you've added what? The independent clause. So, notice that the comma separates the two, right? Because you cannot run, as you can see here, if a dependent clause, which is your incomplete sentence, begins that sentence, that means it starts it, then guess what? A comma has to follow it. Because you can't ram, right, or bump an incomplete thought into a sentence. You just can't do that. And I want you to think about it this way. You already know that rule, but you may not realize it. For instance, if you start a sentence off with a word like first, you already know that first, what goes after the word first? A comma. And then you start your sentence, right? You remember that. First, second, third, as you're, organizing a paragraph. So you recognize that that word first is incomplete in nature, and you need to protect the sentence so you don't confuse the reader. So here's the rule. After you write your dependent clause, right, although it's raining, you put your comma there, and then you finish your sentence. That is how you punctuate a complex sentence when you have, now I'm going to introduce a new word to you, when you have a subordinate clause starting it off, okay? And subordinate clause, let's go ahead, I'm going to backtrack and kind of explain where that word comes from and what it means. When we're crafting or trying to write a complex sentences use what we call subordinating conjunctions when we craft them. That means that there are certain words in the English language that automatically, when we use them, they create a dependent, right? A dependent situation. Now, so whether we say the word dependent clause or independent or dependent clause or subordinate clause, I want you to think of those as the same thing. So don't let the language the English teachers use confuse you. Okay? Really, what I'm saying is that they're incomplete in nature. So, to craft a complex sentence, you need to first begin with a subordinate conjunction, like after, although, though, unless. All of these words you see listed here, since. So, and it will force you to write an incomplete thought. If you use any of these sentences to begin a sentence, any of these words to begin a sentence, it will force you to write an incomplete thought. For example, let's look at the word although. Although I'm running late, right? Although I'm running late, I'm still going on the interview. I hope that never happens to you. But notice what I just said. Although I'm running late, I'm still going on the interview. Where would the comma go? Just listen to the cadence of the sentence. Although I'm running late, I am still going on the interview. Although I'm running late, comma, I'm still going on the interview. You hear that? Try another one. As long as you continue not to study, you will fail. Listen to that one. As long as you continue not to study, comma, you will fail. Do you hear it? But notice what I'm trying to teach you here. When you start a sentence with a subordinate conjunction, like after, in order that, once, since, right, because, you're going to force yourself to write an incomplete sentence. Now, we can call it an incomplete sentence. You can call it a subordinate clause. You can call it a dependent clause. I don't care really what you call it. What I want you to understand is what's happening when you're writing. Now I want to focus on the word because. You may recall that when you were like in 3rd grade, maybe, your teacher told you never start a sentence with because. And the reason why he or she told you that is because they knew something that you didn't know. They knew what I'm trying to teach you right now, that when you use the word because or any other word on this listing, okay, a subordinate conjunction, you're going to automatically create an incomplete sentence. And they really thought, they wanted you to stay away from the word because they didn't want you to write a fragment. So now that you're older and wiser, I'm going to tell you that they lied to you. They lied to you. You can actually start a sentence with because. You just need to know how to punctuate it and how to manage that sentence and write it properly. So, for example, if I say this, because she was late to the interview, she did not get the job. Right? Now listen to that. Because she was late for the interview, comma, she did not get the job. She did not get the job is the sentence. You hear that? The full sentence. So if I walked up to you and just said this, because she was late to the job interview, is that a sentence? Listen, is that a complete thought? Because she was late for the job interview and I walked away, would you understand what I meant? Absolutely not, because I didn't finish the thought, did I? Because she was late for the job interview, comma, right? She did not get the job. So let's go down and look at these examples again. So really, when I craft and create a complex sentence, I have to do 2 things. Okay? And there's 2 ways you can do it. But the first way I'm showing you is when you put the subordinate clause, right, or the incomplete thought, right, in the front. Although it's raining outside, we're going to the park. Because she was late to the interview, comma, she did not get the job. So even though what I'm saying in the sentence is different, I want you to understand that the pattern is the same. Okay? Now, here's the tricky part, so don't get frustrated when I introduce this to you. Here's the difference. If I put the subordinate conjunction, remember my subordinate conjunction are these words. If I use any of these words not at the beginning of the sentence, but in the middle of the sentence, guess what? My comma goes away. It's not needed. So let's take a look. We are going to the park although it is raining. The comma's gone. But guess what? It is still a complex sentence. I know it looks like a simple sentence, but it's not. Because you have the combination of a full sentence merged with an incomplete thought. Okay? So a comma is used to separate subordinate clauses from a complete sentence when and only if you run the danger of putting that subordinate clause in front and starting with the sentence. Now I want you to think back to what I talked to you about in the first video on simple sentences. I stressed to you that sentences typically, I use that word, typically begin with a subject. Right? When I use the word typically, I was giving myself a little flexibility because sometimes they don't. And here is an example of when they don't. But remember, here's what you need to understand. When a sentence doesn't begin with a subject, guess what? Here's the good news. That typically means what? That you're beginning a sentence with either an incomplete word or an incomplete phrase. And a comma has to go somewhere, right? It just has to go after that incomplete thought or word. So remember earlier, and I'm going to type it in, this example, when I said, I used the word first, I'm going to use another transition like, she was late for the interview. I'm going to put a period there and start a whole new sentence. As a result, she was not hired. Now what I want you to understand is that this is a new sentence, but I did not start it with a what? A subject. I added a transition at the beginning. And notice that a comma has to follow me. See that? It's a pattern of sentences and structure that you need to understand. And just like in this case, although it's raining outside, right? Notice it. I started without a subject. I started with a subordinate conjunction. See that? I started with an incomplete thought, which means what? A comma has to separate. I need to protect my sentence, guys. I can't just run an incomplete thought into my sentence because it's going to confuse my reader. So the comma is there as a buffer between those two things that's going on so you don't confuse the reader. Okay? So although it's raining outside, comma, you hear that pause? We're going to the part. She was late for the interview. As a result, she was not hired. Okay? But I want you to see the common touch here, the common connection between what's going on in this sentence and what's going on here. Let's look at another example. Because of the storm, school was canceled. Again, I'm just trained to know that my comma is going to follow my subordinate clause. See the pattern? Although it's raining, comma, we're going to the park. She was late for the interview. As a result, she was not hired. Because of the storm, comma, school was canceled. And the great news is this, that this is something that you have to study. You have to study subordinate conjunctions, guys. This is not something that's just going to come to you. You need to know, these are I used to describe these as dangerous little words. These are dangerous little words that can get you in trouble and cause you to write fragments. Okay? Now I'm going to give you an example of what I mean by the danger of writing a fragment. Here's an example. Let's take a look at the example I just typed out. Because the team was late to the game was canceled. Now, when I read both of those together, they make sense. But see, writing is not just about whether or not when you read things together, they make sense. You have to make sure you're punctuating things properly, you're connecting your ideas and your thoughts correctly. So, notice what happened here. I put a comma at the end of the subordinate clause. I'm going to highlight it for us so everyone can see. Because the team was late to the game, I put a comma. And what that means, when I put a comma at the end of anything, it's a signal, It signals that I have a full sentence. But is that a sentence? First of all, sentences don't begin, right? Or can stand. Sentences typically don't begin with a subordinating conjunction. They begin with subjects. So that's the first clue that you're dealing with an incomplete phrase or word. You're dealing with an incomplete clause here. So, because the team was late to the game, what do I need? How do I fix this? Anyone have any ideas? How do I fix this? Because it's incorrect. That is a fragment. The complete thought is over here, disconnected from the incomplete thought. These two things need to be together, don't they? And how? You just learned. How do you join them? So you ask yourself, okay, the first question you ask yourself is this. Where is my subordinate clause? And when I ask myself that question, what am I really saying? Where is the incomplete thought? That's another way we can say it. It may not be perfect, but that's a good way of looking at it. So, where does it come? Is it at the beginning of the sentence, or is it at the end, or in the middle? It's at the beginning. That's a dangerous place for it to begin, but it's a great sentence if you write it properly. But it's dangerous because it can set you up for a fragment. So how do I fix this? Let's take a look. I do what? I come and I add a comma, right? And I lowercase that, and now I have what? I have a good sentence that is structured properly and punctuated correctly. And my fragment goes away. Because the team was late to the game was canceled. Right? A little redundant. Let's fix it. What do I change that to? I just noticed it was redundant because we said the game. It. There you go. And it's still right. It's still a sentence. Because the team was late to the game, it was canceled. Right? See that? That is called a complex sentence. Now, let's say, which is the second type, remember what I told you before. If I put my subordinate conjunction, the word because, right? If I put it in the middle of the sentence, what goes away? I don't need my comma anymore. So let's think how we can do this. The game was canceled because the team was what? Very good. Late. So when I write it this way and I put my subordinate conjunction in the middle of the sentence, the comma goes away. Please don't do this, students. That is just wrong. That is just incorrect. Never use a comma around because. You just don't need it. You never use commas around because in other subordinate conjunctions. And you may ask yourself, well, how will I know? This seems a little tricky. How will I know when I'm dealing with a subordinating conjunction? The only way that you're going to know is that you need to study them. There's no way around that. You need to be aware of what you're dealing with when you're writing, okay? But the other thing I'll say to you is this. Another clue is that you may not know what to call this. And I'll give you an example. Look at this sentence that I just wrote. I'm going to highlight it, or I'm going to make it a little larger. Excuse me. When the team got off the bus, they were told to go home. Okay, it's a basic sentence, all right? But let's forget. I'm going to show you how you don't need to be an English teacher to know how to write well. Okay? And you don't always have to know what to call things in order to write a decent sentence. But when you just look at it, if you remember something that I taught you in the first video, which was all sentences begin typically with a subject plus what? A verb plus what? A complete thought, predicate. That's the normal cadence, right, of how we write. For example, I'll give you a very basic sentence here. Kim is my sister. Okay? Notice that sentences in English begin with the subject, then what? Verbs, then what? Complete thoughts, predicates. Now, you can use that to test whether or not you're dealing with a situation in which you have an incomplete or subordinate phrase or word starting off a sentence. And the way you do that, you go to the very first word and you ask yourself a very important question. Is that word a subject? Right? Is it a subject? And if it's not, then guess what? You are dealing with an incomplete word or phrase. Okay? So then you need to read it and analyze it. When the team got off the bus, they were told to go home. I'm going to take the comma away. And let's just look at it again. When the team got off the bus, they were told to go home. Then you have to ask yourself, okay, how do you figure out where the comma goes? Well, you figure out where the comma goes because you know that after the incomplete statement, what's going to pop up to make it a sentence? You're going to look for what? The subject. Absolutely. You're going to look for the actual new sentence. What is that sentence? What is that independent clause that makes this first part of the sentence, what makes it make sense? So when the team got off the bus, what happened? They were told to go home. They is my subject. See that? Were. Right? You see that? We're getting into the subject and the verb. Go what? Home. So the comma goes after the incomplete phrase. So once the incomplete phrase ends and the new sentence begins, right there, you've got to read it and analyze it. When the team got off the bus. Please don't do this. I can tell you, I can speak for all the English teachers around the world. We are tired of seeing you do things like this. Now let's analyze this. Although it is late, she's going to the library. No, you do not put a comma after the word although. Although is a subordinate conjunction, and it will set up a subordinate clause. A clause is a group of words that are, you see that? Although it is late, it is here where you put the comma. So again, on behalf of every English teacher in America, we are begging you, stop putting commas after the word although, okay? Or even though, or for that matter, any subordinate conjunction, because these are setting up incomplete clauses, groups of words, okay? Not just the word itself, right? So because it's raining, till death do us part, right? Even though I'm late, after the game, right? It forces a whole clause, a whole thing, okay? So, although what? Although it is late. When what? When the team got off the bus. You can ask yourself that question to figure out where the comma goes. But again, look for the start of the new sentence. She is going. That cadence will pick back up. Okay? Alright, now, last but not least, the last thing I want to say to you is this. If you want to know how to truly write complex sentences, you need to practice writing them. You need to study the writing packet and practice writing them and actually study. This is something you really do have to study. You have to know the subordinating conjunctions. You have to remember that if you put them at the beginning of the sentence, you need a comma, but if they come in the middle, the comma goes away. These are things you have to know and also study and also practice. I hope this presentation has been helpful. If you have additional questions on any of the 4 types of sentences, including the complex sentence, please talk to your instructor or seek help through the writing tutor. Thank you.